So today we're going to talk about dating violence and dating aggression. So this lecture material is going to correspond to Chapter 7 from your textbook. But before we get into the details about dating violence, I wanted to first kind of talk about how this particular topic might be triggering for some people. So because of how common dating aggression and dating violence are within romantic relationships, it's very likely that either you personally have experienced one of the things that we're going to talk about today, or you may know someone that's personally experienced dating aggression and dating violence. So I wanted to direct your attention to the campus resources that we have here at the university. So I've included the Student Advocacy Resource Center support line in the lecture slides today. And the primary reason for that is just to offer individuals that may be currently dealing with issues related to dating violence or dating aggression some potential resources and avenues for additional assistance. If any of you would like to talk to me privately about any of these things, feel free to email me or get in contact with me through Moodle, and I would be happy to direct you to some resources. So that being said, today we're going to be talking about some definitions of some of the common terms related to dating violence and sexual assault. And we're going to look at some of the issues surrounding those definitions. We're also going to talk about risk factors associated with dating violence and sexual assault. We're going to talk about characteristics that are commonly associated with perpetrators of domestic violence and sexual assault. And we're going to wrap up today's lesson about possible explanations for why domestic violence and sexual assault might occur, based on what we currently know in psychological research. So let's first start off by talking about dating violence. So let's just get a sense of what we mean when we say the term dating violence. So as we've talked about in previous lessons, there are often issues that come up around trying to define terms like dating violence and intimate partner violence and sexual assault. So one of those issues is that different researchers and psychologists have different interpretations of what exactly constitutes dating violence. So this is going to be no different. Not only do we have differences in terms of research, but we also have differences in terms of what does it legally mean to engage in dating violence tactics. So the definition that we're going to use for this class, you'll see on the slide. So dating violence for this class is going to be any sort of activity that involves perpetration or the threat of an act of physical violence by at least one member of an unmarried dyad against another within the context of a dating process. So let's unpack that a little bit. What exactly are we talking about in that definition of dating violence? What we're really talking about, first and foremost, is either an actual act of physical violence, so one person actually physically hurting another person, or we're talking about the threat of physical violence. So that threat of physical violence could be referring to a lot of different things. It might include psychological aggression and violence. It might include financial abuse. There's all kinds of things that fall underneath that particular umbrella. Another part of this definition is we're talking about either that actual physical violence or threat of physical violence has to occur by at least one person of that couple. So with that part of the definition, we're saying that sometimes dating violence occurs just by one person in the relationship, and at other times, dating violence can be bidirectional, or both people can engage in dating violence within the context of a relationship. Typically with dating violence, we're talking about unmarried couples or couples that are not cohabitating. So usually we're referring to either high school relationships or college-age relationships in which the couple is not married and isn't cohabitating. So additionally, with dating violence relationships, there does not have to be sexual intimacy between the dating partners. So it's not required that there is a sexual relationship between the partners of the relationship, and it doesn't have to be necessarily between a man and a woman. So with dating violence, we're looking at both heterosexual and homosexual relationships. Now, some issues that come up around legal definitions of dating violence. Often, different states will have different definitions for dating violence, or they won't have a definition for dating violence at all. So often individuals that try to bring up charges related to dating violence end up having to bring a charge of physical assault because the state might not have a specific law regarding dating violence. They don't take into account the context of the violence being within a relationship. They just sort of look at, did one person physically assault another person? So something else that might come up in talking about dating violence is this sort of distinction between dating violence and intimate partner violence. So you're going to hear those two terms quite often, and sometimes people are going to use those terms interchangeably. But is dating violence really the same thing as intimate partner violence? There's a lot of overlap between these two terms, certainly. We're talking about similar behaviors, but sort of the difference between dating violence and intimate partner violence, at least in psychological research, is that with dating violence, we're typically talking about sort of younger individuals that are engaged in those unmarried, non-cohabitating relationships. Where with intimate partner violence, we're referring to typically adults and older individuals that are either married or cohabitating. Another distinction between dating violence and intimate partner violence in psychology is that typically with intimate partner violence research, those individuals that are being studied are engaged in a sexual relationship. So, as previously stated, with dating violence, it doesn't have to necessarily involve a sexually intimate relationship. So those are sort of the main differences between dating violence and intimate partner violence, but certainly there's tons of overlap in terms of what we're actually studying. Other sort of definitional and research issues that come up around dating violence, there's a lot of controversy over what is actually considered to be violent behavior. So it might seem sort of straightforward at first when you think about physical abuse in particular. If someone hits another person or someone kicks or bites another person, it seems like that would be considered physical abuse. However, with a lot of legal definitions of physical abuse, not only does the person have to engage in hitting behavior or kicking behavior or whatever the case may be, but that victim of violence actually has to have physical injury. So if that person is hit, there actually has to be a bruise there or some other form of physical injury for it to be considered physical violence. Now, if there are issues related to something as straightforward as physical violence, you can imagine that more complicated things like psychological violence and sexual assault are going to be even harder to define. So when you think about psychological violence, there are all kinds of different behaviors that might fall underneath that umbrella. And so often, in particular with legal definitions, there's tons of gray area involved in trying to define and enforce laws related to psychological abuse. Additionally, that comes up with definitions surrounding sexual assault. So you can see that all of these issues that we've talked about in previous lessons are going to continue to not only affect how we legally deal with these issues, but also how we research these issues. So in terms of how common dating violence is, we've got a really wide range currently estimated in psychological research and also through national statistics. So currently we're looking at a range from 9% of individuals in dating relationships to 65% of people in dating relationships that have experienced some form of dating violence. That's a huge gap and a huge range to try and figure out how common dating violence is in romantic relationships. Now, what we do know is that dating violence tends to decrease with age. So the older individuals get, the less likely they are to encounter dating violence in a romantic relationship. But also sort of mixed up in that estimate of prevalence rates, it's including both psychological abuse and physical abuse, but it's unclear of whether or not that's including sexual abuse. So we don't really have a good estimate right now of how common dating violence is, and it's certainly an area where future research is going to be really important.